It's becoming very clear that even with Taylor Decker set to return in 2026, the Detroit Lions cannot afford to ignore the long-term future of this offensive line, and that conversation is starting right now. Decker is 32 years old, and while he remains one of the steady veteran presences up front, he missed 3 games last season due to a shoulder injury and hasn't completed a full 17-game schedule since 2022. That's not a knock on him, it's reality in the NFL. Availability matters, especially at left tackle, and when you combine that with the fact that last year's swing tackle, Dan Skipper, has retired and is now serving as an offensive assistant on Detroit's 2026 coaching staff, you can see why this position has quietly become one of the more intriguing storylines heading into the draft. The Lions suddenly have a real need for an immediate swing tackle and a dependable reserve who could potentially develop into a future starter. Free agency isn't exactly loaded at offensive tackle this year. Green Bay's Rasheed Walker, 26, is widely considered the top tackle on the market and is listed as the No. 22 free agent on NFL.com, single quotes as top 101 list. After that, the options drop off. So if you're Detroit and you're picking at No. 73 draft, starts to look like the most logical path to address both immediate depth and long-term security. The 2026 NFL draft class at offensive tackle is strong, and that's where this gets interesting. The top 2 prospects, Spencer Fano out of Utah and Francis Mouigo from Miami, are unlikely to still be on the board at No. 17, but depending on how the first half of the draft unfolds, there could still be serious first-round talent available when Detroit is on the clock. Let's talk about some of the names that could realistically be in play. Blake Miller from Clemson is one of the most intriguing prospects in this range. At 6'6" and 315 pounds, he checks so many of the boxes the Lions traditionally value: size, mobility, durability, and mentality. He started 54 games at Clemson and became the first offensive lineman in school history to start every game over a 4-year career. That kind of experience matters. He's seen everything: different pass rushers, different schemes, different defensive looks. He even mentioned at the Combine that he feels like he's seen a lot of football already, but he's still hungry to learn more and soak up knowledge at the next level. That mindset fits perfectly in a room led by veterans and coached by Hank Fraley. Then you have Caden Proctor from Alabama, and physically, he's one of the most impressive athletes in this draft class pound for pound. He's 6'7", 366 pounds, and Alabama even used him at both tackle and fullback. The big conversation with teams this week has been about managing his weight. Proctor said his ideal playing weight in the NFL will be around 350 to 355 pounds, and he plans to maintain that at the pro level. If he does, you're looking at a massive athletic presence who could develop into something special. The Lions have shown they're not afraid to invest in traits if they believe in the developmental structure around the player. Monroe Freeling from Georgia is another name that jumps out. He's 6'7", 315 pounds, started every game at left tackle last season, and has the length and athleticism to play either side. He's a bit raw, with just 16 career starts, but the upside is obvious. Freeling himself points to his athleticism and his sets and pass protection as strengths that will translate, and here's where Detroit's coaching comes into play again. Under Hank Fraley, the Lions have developed offensive linemen successfully. A prospect like Freeling, who might need refinement but has clear physical tools, could be a strong fit in that environment. Caleb Lomu from Utah is another potential first-round grade player at 6'6" and 308 pounds. He was a 2-year starter with strong movement skills and a high ceiling. What stands out about Lomu is his comfort with learning behind veterans. He talked about coming into Utah as a freshman surrounded by veteran linemen and how much he valued that structure and culture. If you're the Lions, that's music to your ears. You already have established tackles. You don't necessarily need a week 1 starter. You need someone who can contribute as a swing tackle while developing into the next long-term piece. Now, if Detroit decides to go in a different direction at No. 17, Day 2 could still offer options. Max Ihenekor from Arizona State, Jennings Dunker out of Iowa, and Trezon 3 from Texas A&M are names to monitor in the second round. Zun brings some inside flexibility, which always adds value when you're building depth across the line. It's also important to remember that Detroit does not currently own a third-round pick after trading it last season to move up and select wide receiver Isaac Tesla. That makes the second-round pick even more critical if they don't address tackle in the first round. So here's the big picture. This isn't about replacing Taylor Decker tomorrow. It's about protecting the future of a roster that believes it's in a championship window. The offensive line has been one of the foundations of this team's identity. If there's even a small crack forming in the long-term outlook at tackle, Brad Holmes and this front office have shown they're willing to act before it becomes a problem. The question for you is this: if one of those first-round tackles is sitting there at No. 17, Do you pull the trigger and secure the future now, or do you trust Decker's timeline and address another need first? Because here's where this decision becomes even more layered, and it's something you have to look at from both a short-term and long-term lens. On one hand, Taylor Decker is still the starter when he's on the field. He brings stability, leadership, and experience. But on the other hand, we've already seen the physical toll start to show. Missing 3 games last season with a shoulder injury and not having played a full 17-game schedule since 2022 isn't catastrophic, but it's enough to raise the question about durability moving forward. And when you're building a roster that expects to compete deep into January, you can't afford to be reactive at left tackle. You have to be proactive. Losing Dan Skipper to retirement adds another layer to this. Skipper wasn't just a depth piece, he was the swing tackle. He was the emergency option. He was the guy you trusted to step in if something happened. Now he's transitioned into an offensive assistant role on the 2026 coaching staff, which is great for continuity in the building, but it leaves a real void on the depth chart. That swing tackle role isn't a luxury. It's a necessity over a 17-game season. So when you look at this draft class again, it starts to make even more sense why Detroit could strongly consider addressing tackle at no 17. The beauty of taking someone like Blake Miller, Caden Proctor, Monroe Freeling, or Caleb Lemieux in the first round isn't just about 2026, it's about 2027 and beyond. It's about having a year, maybe 2, to develop behind Decker, to learn the system, to refine technique under Hank Fraley, and to be fully ready when the torch needs to be passed. Think about the developmental timeline. A player like Monroe Freeling, who only has 16 starts, might not be a plug-and-play Pro Bowl tackle immediately, but in Detroit's structure, with veteran leadership and coaching continuity, that raw athleticism can be molded. That's how you sustain offensive line dominance. You don't wait until you're desperate, you draft and develop before the drop-off ever happens. And then there's the draft capital factor. Without a third-round pick, because that was used last season to move up for Isaac Tesla, the Lions don't have as much flexibility in the middle rounds if they pass on tackle at no 17, and the board doesn't fall favorably in the second round, they could be left reaching or settling. Max Ihanacore, Jennings Dunker, and Trey Zun 3 are intriguing day 2 names, especially with Zun's ability to potentially kick inside. But there's a difference between first-round traits and second-round projection. Another thing to consider is positional value. Offensive tackle remains one of the premium positions in the NFL. If you believe one of these prospects has legitimate long-term starting upside, passing on that at 17 could be a risk, especially in a class that's widely considered strong at the position. The free agent market simply doesn't offer the same upside or long-term control. Rasheed Walker may be the top option available, but even he comes with market price considerations and no developmental runway inside your own building. And let's be honest, the Lions' identity is built through the trenches. The offensive line has been the backbone of this team's physical style. Protecting that identity matters just as much as adding playmakers or addressing other roster spots. If this front office sees someone who fits their culture tough, durable, athletic, coachable, it would not be surprising at all if they make the move. But here's where it gets even more interesting. If they do take a tackle at 17, what does that signal? Is it simply depth and development? Or is it a clear indication that they're planning for life after Decker sooner rather than later? That's the underlying storyline. Fans will be debating all offseason at the same time. If they pass on tackle in the first round, that's also a message. It would suggest confidence in Decker's ability to stay healthy and confidence that they can find a capable swing tackle in the second round. That decision alone will tell us a lot about how this front office views its timeline and risk tolerance. So now it really comes down to philosophy. Do you secure the future at one of the most important positions on the field while you have the opportunity? Or do you prioritize another need and trust that the depth can be addressed later? And the deeper you go into this, the clearer it becomes that this isn't just about filling a backup role, it's about protecting the standard that the Detroit Lions have built in the trenches. When you talk about this team's rise, you inevitably come back to the offensive line. The physicality, the protection, the consistency that doesn't happen by accident. It's built through planning, and planning means anticipating decline before it shows up on Sundays. With Taylor Decker entering his age 32 season and coming off a year where he missed 3 games, the front office has to look beyond just 2026. You can respect everything Decker brings while also recognizing that tackle is one of the most demanding positions on the field. If the shoulder issues linger or if availability becomes more unpredictable, you don't want to be scrambling mid-season. The retirement of Dan Skipper, now transitioning into an offensive assistant role, removed that safety net. There's value in continuity on the coaching staff, but roster-wise, that swing tackle spot is wide open. Over the course of a full season, injuries happen. Edge rushers rotate. Matchups vary weekly. Having a reliable reserve isn't optional, it's part of contending. That's why the evaluation of prospects like Blake Miller, Caden Proctor, Monroe Freeling, and Caleb Lemieux Lambeau becomes so critical. Each one offers something slightly different, but all carry the kind of traits that translate to long-term upside. Miller's 54 career starts speak to durability and experience. Proctor's size and athletic ceiling are rare. Freeling's length and movement skills suggest developmental growth under the right coaching. Lomu's comfort learning behind veterans fits perfectly with the current locker room structure, and that coaching element matters. Under Hank Fraley, this staff has shown an ability to develop linemen with traits into polished professionals. That makes drafting a slightly raw but high-upside tackle far less risky than it might appear on paper. You're not throwing a rookie into chaos, you're placing him into a system with structure, accountability, and veteran leadership. Now, consider the alternative. If Detroit bypasses tackle at 17, the second round becomes pivotal. Prospects like Max Ihenekor, Jennings Dunker, and Trey Zune III offer value, especially with Zune's potential interior flexibility. But without a third-round pick, moved last season in the trade to select Isaac Tesla, there's less margin for error. The Lions can't afford to miss if they wait. Free agency doesn't provide the same comfort either. While Rasheed Walker is considered the top tackle option available, signing a veteran solution carries financial implications and doesn't offer the same developmental window as drafting and grooming a young player under team control. So the real debate isn't whether tackle is in need today, it's whether you believe it becomes a need tomorrow and whether you act now to prevent that moment from arriving unexpectedly. Championship windows are fragile. The best organizations stay ahead of decline rather than reacting to it. If the Lions use pick no 17 on a tackle, it signals foresight. It says they're thinking 2 and 3 years down the road. It reinforces the idea that the offensive line remains the heartbeat of this roster. If they go another direction, it signals trust. Trust in Decker's health, trust in the developmental depth chart, and trust that value will still be there in round 2. And that's why this decision could quietly shape the next era of Detroit football. It won't be the flashiest headline on draft night, but it might be one of the most important. And the more you sit with it, the more you realize this decision at no 17 is about organizational discipline. The Detroit Lions have gotten to this point because they've avoided panic moves and instead built with intention. That's why this offensive line has become one of the most stable units on the roster. But stability in the NFL is temporary unless you constantly refresh it. When you evaluate the situation around Taylor Decker, it's not about doubting his ability. It's about understanding At 32, every season becomes more physically demanding. Missing 3 games last year with a shoulder issue is a reminder of how quickly depth can be tested. If an injury stretches longer, suddenly, that swing tackle spot isn't just a backup role, it's protecting your quarterback in meaningful games. And that's why losing Dan Skipper to retirement changes the math. His move into an offensive assistant role is great for continuity, but on the field, someone has to absorb those snaps. That's not a minor detail. Over 17 games,